They didn't really want him because he wasn't a yes man. So we had a very hard campaign. And they put out advertisements that said he was, going to give drugs to kids and he was going to do all these terrible things. And I said, Ron, why don't we do a cookbook and put the kids' pictures in and see that we haven't really been negligent parents. I mean, all the kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, we have 3 doctors and an engineer and, the other runs our educational foundation. And so he said, I think they'd rather hear me talk about the something stabilization fund or whatever. And I said, well, yeah, I'm sure they would, but I think this might be a good idea. So he said, okay, let's do it. And so now he calls it his secret weapon. Yeah. Because people don't want to throw it away. It's not just like a campaign piece, you can throw one away. And as we were talking this evening, we were sitting there and Ron said, when I get up, we've never made mistakes before like we have. We have 2 errors in this cookbook. And so I've been getting up and I've been saying, okay, now there's a lady in Washington State who on page 22 sent this wonderful recipe for Good Hill Dream something cookies. They won't work without 2 cups of flour. And then there was one other on page 5. There's a banana bread recipe. These are for the cooks now, some of you who are cooking. It won't work without a half a cup of oil added to what's in there. And Ron said, why didn't we just mimeograph a little thing like that and put it in the cookbook? And I said, well, why are you telling me that now? But I think that we'll have to do that. But if anybody really wants to cook and wants to make sure, you can check with me later. Now my real job is to introduce the man of my life for the last 55 years. And it would take you a long time, take me a long time to tell you everything, but just a few little things that you may know. Ron is a medical doctor, OBGYN, and has delivered 4,000 babies. And only 2 of ours just by mistake, just out of necessity. He did his training at Duke Medical School, and then his OB training at McGee Women's Hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He did some training in Detroit, Michigan, and then the Cuban crisis came, and he got to be a captain in the Air Force and fly with all the important people because they always wanted the flight surgeon along. So those were good years, all the growing years to our growing family. And then one day he said to me, I think I'm going to run for Congress. And I said, why? Because, here we had a huge medical practice in Texas and we had all these kids and things. And I thought, he said, well, don't worry, I'm not going to win because I'm not, like Santa Claus. I'm not going to offer them anything. He said, I just want to get it off my chest because, there's so many things happening in our country. And if I know what's wrong and I don't say anything, then I'm just as wrong as the person who's doing it wrong. So I said, well, okay. And so here we are today. And now I'll let him tell you the rest of the story.
But she did forget one thing. We have one other member of our family with us today, and that's Linda, our granddaughter. I frequently mention that the first speech I gave against going to war against Iraq was a long time before 9/11. It was in the spring of 1998 because that's when the policy changed that the purpose was to overthrow that government. So we've been talking about foreign policy for a long time, trying to, prevent these wars from coming about and insisting on declaration of war and these various things that should prevent this. But today, guess what? Every week it seems that the percentage of Americans that want to say, we've had enough, it's time to come home, 75% now say, get home back. In the intellectual war that's going on, we're really winning. It is an intellectual revolution, and we're gaining by leaps and bounds. It is estimated that for 100 years, before our revolution in 1776, there was actually revolutionary ideas on the principles of liberty, and they knew history, and they knew about property rights, and they knew what the Magna Carta said, and they knew what Old Testament history showed about the danger of having kings, and that all came together, and finally there was a political revolution after the intellectual revolution. Well, the same thing has been happening in this country. So the intellectual revolution of the return to the continuation of the development of a free society, probably 30 or 40 years ago. For instance, I personally became aware of this happening, getting introduced into an organization that some of you may know about, even though it's not well known, and that was the Foundation for Economic and Education. And this was started by a man by the name of Leonard Read. Matter of fact, I think he started his business career in the Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles. But he put this organization together in the 50s. But he was one of the few who published the information that was so necessary to keep this spirit alive. He befriended Mises when Mises came over here, and Mises was denied any credible position in any university. And yet the FEE recognized his significance. And there was one free market journalist back at that time, Henry Hazlitt, and he too befriended Mises. And Mises, the interesting thing about Mises, who was really was the leader in the 20th century on Austrian economics. He was Jewish and from Austria, and of course the handwriting was on the wall. He knew he had to get out to survive, and I don't know, 1939 or 1940 he got out and came to this country. He was 60 years old. It was after he was 60 years old he learned English and wrote his great book, Human Action. So, but he more or less, along with Leonard Read and many others at that time, but today the number of groups that are promoting intellectually these arguments are very, very numerous. And I think what has happened now in this political campaign, it sort of is bringing this together. A lot of time I get more credit than really I deserve because I may be calling attention to this, but it's the work of others that brought together and changed people's minds and attitudes. But it's catching, it's spreading, it is spreading much faster than I've ever dreamed. And it might be, maybe it's an idea whose time has really come. An idea as time has come, armies and the politicians and the governments can't stop it. And back in the old days, before we had the internet, of course, ideas spread by pamphleteering, word of mouth, and you could still spread a lot of information. Today, the modern technology has helped us, and maybe that's why we're moving along more quickly. But the opposition, those who cling to power and desire to have power, for the benefit of the special interest, they know too how the real message is being spread with the tremendous help of the internet. And this is why you see the systematic attack on the internet, and now with the legislation being passed and the computer center being started up in Utah, which is going to control not billions of items and bits of information on all of us, trillions and trillions. And I keep looking for the optimistic side, and the only way I can look at this optimistically is to think, well, there'll still be bureaucrats, and they'll still mess up, they'll never figure out the information they collected. You know, this is what happens on these the financial transaction reports, which actually started in the 70s, and that had to do with, they pretended it had to only do with drug money, but it really had to do with collecting taxes. So they've accumulated these billions and billions of items on these financial transaction reports, and probably 99.9% are just innocent people filling out reports. And it turns out that there were always so many that when you study the efficiency of them really accomplishing it, it hasn't been all that great. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. But the best way is to make sure that we quit building these units and passing laws like the Patriot Act and all these other things that are invading our privacy. We just need to restore in this country the principles that the founders gave us, especially with privacy issues. Restore the Fourth Amendment is what we need. Many times we're asked, though, how exactly does the transition come? How do you get rid of the Fed? Well, we continue to do this, what we're doing. The most important thing on the Fed, as well as our dollar, unfortunately, will be eventually destroyed as long as they keep doing what they're doing. So there's an end point to this, but that's sort of being overly pessimistic and saying, well, you can't do anything until the collapse comes. But when a collapse comes, there's a great danger that they will just come up with more authoritarianism and more dictatorship. So I think the most important thing that we can do at this moment, and this is where we've made a lot of progress, is exposing the Federal Reserve. Auditing the Federal Reserve is a real good starting point. But the whole notion of the Federal Reserve has been such an instrument of inviting big government. Just think of the system that we have. We have politicians whose main goal is to stay in office. And they've been taught by liberals and conservatives that deficits don't really matter. And it is true. Conservatives, the conservative supply-siders have said, don't worry about the deficit, lower the tax rate, which was a good idea, and deficits don't matter, and this sort of thing. But liberals say deficits don't matter. Spending more when in a recession, that's very important. So the politicians get conditions that you don't really have to worry that much about deficits. And then they say, well, how's the best way to stay in office? Well, be an errand boy. Say, you know, I can go up and work the system better than anybody else. I'm going to get more benefits, and I know so-and-so, and he's going to put me on this committee, and on and on. They do that, and that happened for a lot of decades. And we were super wealthy. We had a lot of money in the bank. We had a currency that was backed by something. But that's all gone now. We owe $5 trillion to foreigners right now. And we have no money in the bank. And there's nothing that backs our currency. And instead of having a reserve behind a certificate such as gold and silver, we don't have gold and silver, but we have debt. It used to be that we had U.S. government debt, and we still have a lot of U.S. government debt. So the politician is rewarded for spending money, delivering the goods and services to his constituents. They don't, well, we can't tax, they won't like too much of taxes to pay all the bills. So what they do is they print a treasury bill, or just put it in a computer, send it over to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve say, oh, this week we need $10 billion. Sometimes 15, sometimes $20 billion in 1 week. And now it's astounding. The deficit is $1.5 trillion a year. So when they create the treasury bill, and the Fed buys the treasury bill with money out of thin air, then they have that, and that is the backing of the currency. So if they have $2 trillion worth of treasury bills that they bought with nothing, then they can print $2 trillion worth of paper money and then pass it out. It makes no sense, and they think it's, people can't understand that. I think it's rather simple. What we can't understand is how people believe that stuff they teach us, you know, about how this thing works. But with with the financial crisis that hit, it gave a lot of credibility to the views of Austrian economics and the concern that we all had about the housing bubble and the financial bubble that has existed. And this has really gotten the attention of a lot of people, and now the Federal Reserve justifiably is on the defensive, because without the Federal Reserve and this collusion between big spenders, this wouldn't happen. I read an article one time, and this is probably true, except for rare examples, that governments always use inflation to fight wars, because it's necessary and you can't borrow enough money, so they always debase the currency, whether they dilute the metals, print too much paper money, or use computers. So fighting wars generate inflation as well as runaway domestic spending. Now the entitlement system is always panned off as, we got to have an entitlement system to make the system fair. We got to help the poor people and take more from the rich people. But that's all pretense, because the literal destruction of a currency automatically transfers wealth from the middle class to the wealthy, because the middle class gets the money last. By the time the value of the money goes down, and they get the higher prices. But if you get the contract in the military industrial complex, or if you're in the banking system, then you get to practice fractional reserve banking. All of a sudden, they get tremendous benefits. The money circulates, and the people who most are penalized, low middle income, the people who didn't want to go on the dole, they have a job, they're barely making it. If they're retired people trying to survive on Social Security, they get the higher rate of inflation, and then they fix the rate of interest low for the banks. At the same time, they cheat the people who are trying to take care of themselves. And then they call that the entitlement system. And if you're against entitlements, you hate the poor. And that's a little more complex in explaining, but the truth is, if you care about the poor, you get out of this entitlement business. What you do is you release creative energy, release the idea that you're rewarded for your efforts, and that you want a free market where there's prosperity, where there are jobs, instead of this intervention where they create bubbles and then they create recessions and depressions. So the true humanitarian has to argue the case for freedom and free markets and sound money and contracts and private property rights, not this whole idea of regulation. What's based behind regulation is they know that generating a lot of easy credit will stimulate businesses to do so many things, and they'll make mistakes. And they tend to recognize this, so they say, well, the way we're going to handle this is we'll just have regulations out there. So they create the incentive and the ability to make mistakes, and then they think it's the regulations that will prevent people from making mistakes. And it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work. What it does, the regulations hurt the people who are trying to make an honest living, and they squeeze out the little guy, they squeeze out the people who are competing with the big corporations. They say, what we need to do is give more money to the students. We'll give them a loan. We'll have them borrow money, and so they entice them into the system. The students see that's the only way we can survive. So they borrow, and now the students getting out of college are the biggest debtors. They have more debt than the older generation has on credit cards, and they could still survive if they could get a job. Yeah. But now, the statistics are horrible. If you're just getting out of college, the opportunity to get a decent job. So this is the reason, if you tell it to them straight, I think even the students would like to get an easy road out and an easy bailout, realize there's something wrong with the system, and they're receptive to the argument that what I'd like to do is create a system where there would be jobs, get rid of the income tax, and allow you to get out of Social Security if you wanted to. Thank you very much for joining in this campaign and being here today. And be optimistic, but be cautious, because if we don't do our job, we're in for a big mess. But right now, I'm optimistic to think we're on the right track and we are going to have successes. Thank you very much.